August 19, 1945. 3 weeks after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast crackled across Japan, and 2 weeks after the formal signing aboard the USS Missouri. Across the American South, victory celebrations had given way to the complex business of processing thousands of prisoners of war for repatriation. But in a hastily converted tobacco warehouse outside Valdosta, Georgia, something unprecedented was about to unfold. A transport truck carrying 17 Japanese women rolled through the gates of a makeshift detention facility, and with them came a story that would challenge everything both captors and captives believed about enemies, about forgiveness, and about the transformative power of simple human kindness. The women who stepped down from that military truck represented an unusual category of prisoner. They were members of Japan's Women's Volunteer Labor Corps and military auxiliary units, captured in the Philippines during the final chaotic weeks of the Pacific War. Unlike male prisoners who filled camps across America, these women had served in administrative, medical, and communications roles. They ranged in age from 20 to 28, young women who had believed they were serving their emperor and homeland with honor. Now they stood on foreign soil, surrounded by guards speaking an incomprehensible language, facing an uncertain future in the land they had been taught to fear and hate. 24-year-old Fumiko Tanaka stood near the front of the group, her slight frame rigid with the military bearing that had been drilled into her during training. She had been a radio operator in Yokohama before volunteering for overseas service, believing the propaganda that promised honor and purpose in supporting Japan's Greater East Asia mission. Her dark eyes, exhausted from weeks of transport through military channels, took in the strange landscape around her. The humid Georgia heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, so different from the climate she had known. Red clay dirt stretched in every direction, and the air carried unfamiliar scents of pine trees and something sweet she couldn't identify. Behind Fumiko stood 22-year-old Sachiko Ishida, a medical assistant from Kyoto, whose hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small cloth bundle containing her few remaining possessions. Her training had prepared her to treat wounded soldiers, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of complete vulnerability in enemy territory. 26-year-old Hisako Yamamoto, an administrative clerk from Osaka, maintained a stoic expression that masked the terror churning in her stomach. All three women shared the same thought, born from months of military indoctrination. They expected brutality, perhaps execution. Certainly the harsh treatment that imperial propaganda had promised would be their fate if captured by Americans. What they saw instead confused them profoundly. The American soldiers watching them carried rifles, yes, but their postures seemed almost casual, lacking the rigid aggression the women had been taught to expect. One young corporal, lanky and sunburned, actually smiled slightly as he gestured for them to follow toward the main building. This small gesture, so contrary to everything they expected, planted the first seed of doubt about the narrative they had been fed their entire adult lives. The women spent their first night in a large dormitory room with iron-frame beds, thin mattresses, and surprisingly clean white sheets. Fumiko lay awake most of the night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Georgia crickets and the occasional distant rumble of trucks. When exhaustion finally pulled her under, her dreams were filled with fragmented images of home, of her family's small house in Yokohama, of whether any of it still existed after the bombing raids she had heard whispered about during transport. Dawn came with the sound of a bell ringing across the compound. The women rose quickly, their military training overriding their disorientation. They dressed in the plain gray cotton dresses that had been provided the night before, replacing the soiled remnants of their auxiliary uniforms. No one spoke as they filed toward the dining hall, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. The uncertainty of what awaited them created a heavy silence that needed no translation. The dining hall was a simple wooden structure with long tables and benches. The women entered to find American soldiers already eating at separate tables, but what struck Fumiko most forcefully was the smell. Rich, buttery, somehow both comforting and completely foreign. Her stomach, empty since the previous day's meager rations, clenched with involuntary hunger. A large African-American woman stood behind a serving counter, her broad face neutral but not unkind. She wore a white apron over a simple dress, and her capable hands moved efficiently as she gestured for the women to take metal trays. The serving process confused them. In the camps during transport, food had been shoved at them with barely concealed contempt. Here, the woman behind the counter actually made eye contact as she ladled portions onto each tray. Fumiko found herself holding a plate containing scrambled eggs, something that might have been bread, and a bowl filled with a white, creamy substance that steamed gently in the morning air. The texture looked almost like rice porridge, but the color was wrong, and the smell was nothing like any rice she had ever encountered. The women sat together at one table, eyeing their food with a mixture of hunger and suspicion. Sachiko whispered in Japanese, her voice barely audible, "What is this white food?" No one had an answer. Hisako, ever practical despite her fear, picked up her spoon with careful deliberation. "We must eat," she said quietly. "Whatever happens to us, we will need strength." The logic was irrefutable. One by one, the women began to eat. The white substance had a texture unlike anything Fumiko had experienced, smooth but slightly grainy, warm and buttery with a subtle corn flavor that was not unpleasant, just bewildering. She chewed slowly, trying to understand what she was tasting. Around her, the other women were having similar experiences, their faces showing confusion, but also the undeniable relief of hunger being satisfied. Across the room, Corporal Wyatt Clemens watched the Japanese women navigate their first American breakfast. He was 19 years old, a farm boy from South Georgia, who had never traveled more than 50 miles from home until the Army sent him to this facility. Corporal Wyatt Clemens had grown up eating grits every morning of his life. His grandmother made them with butter and salt, sometimes with a little cheese when they could afford it, and on special occasions with shrimp caught from the coastal waters. To him, grits were as fundamental as breathing, as ordinary as red clay and pine trees. Watching these Japanese women encounter them for the first time, seeing the confusion and careful acceptance on their faces, he felt an unexpected pang of something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was recognition that these were not the fearsome enemies from propaganda posters, but simply young women far from home, trying to make sense of food they had never seen before. After breakfast, as the women returned their trays to the washing station, Sachiko struggled with a heavy metal tray. Her hands, smaller and more delicate than the sturdy trays had been designed for, fumbled with the weight. The tray tilted dangerously, threatening to spill the remaining contents across the floor. Before she could steady it, Wyatt stepped forward and caught the edge, his sun-weathered hands steadying the tray with practiced ease. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Sachiko saw something in his expression that made her catch her breath. Not anger, not contempt, but simple, human concern. "Thank you," she whispered in English, one of the few phrases she had learned during the long weeks of captivity and transport. Her pronunciation was tentative, the words unfamiliar on her tongue, but the meaning was clear. Wyatt nodded, his young face breaking into a small smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You're welcome, ma'am," he replied, his thick Georgia accent turning the simple words into something musical and strange to her ears. He gestured toward the white substance in the bowl. "Grits," he said slowly, pointing. "We call them grits," Sachiko repeated the word carefully. "Grits." Her accent transformed the single syllable into something that made Wyatt smile more broadly. "Yes, ma'am, grits. Good Southern food." He patted his stomach in an exaggerated gesture that transcended language barriers. Sachiko found herself smiling slightly despite her fear and confusion. The interaction lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it represented a small crack in the wall of assumptions both sides had built. Mrs. Opal Washington had observed the entire exchange from her position behind the serving counter. At 47 years old, she had worked in kitchens her entire adult life, and she had learned to read people with the same skill she used to judge when cornbread was perfectly done. These Japanese girls, she thought to herself, looked lost and scared in ways that reminded her of her own sons when they had first left home for the war. Her eldest boy, Marcus, was somewhere in the Pacific, had been part of the occupation forces in Japan. Her younger son, Leonard, had served in Europe and come home with stories about German prisoners who turned out to be just frightened boys far from their mothers. She had heard the talk in town, the anger and suspicion about having Japanese prisoners housed so close to Valdosta. Folks remembered Pearl Harbor, remembered the years of war and sacrifice. But standing here watching these young women try to navigate a simple breakfast, Opal saw something that challenged her own assumptions. The third morning brought an unexpected development. Captain Theodore Ashford, the facility commander, had spent the previous 2 days reviewing protocols and regulations regarding the treatment of female prisoners of war. At 52 years old, he was a career military man who had served in the First World War and believed deeply in following proper procedures. But he also believed in practical solutions to unusual problems. The 17 Japanese women represented an administrative challenge unlike anything in his experience, and keeping them confined to their dormitory except for meals seemed both wasteful and potentially problematic for morale. Mrs. Opal Washington had approached him after breakfast with a proposal that was as pragmatic as it was unprecedented. "Captain," she had said in her direct manner, "I could use help in that kitchen. These girls are sitting idle all day, and I'm short-handed since my regular assistant went to work at the textile mill. Seems to me we could solve 2 problems at once." Captain Ashford had considered the suggestion carefully, weighing regulations against common sense, and finally nodded his approval with the caveat that Corporal Clemens would maintain watch to ensure security protocols were observed. When Mrs. Washington approached the women's table during breakfast and gestured for them to follow her to the kitchen, confusion rippled through the group. Fumiko exchanged uncertain glances with Sachiko and Hisako. Were they being singled out for punishment? Reassigned to harder labor? The possibilities raced through their minds as they followed the large woman through the swinging doors into the kitchen's steamy interior. What they found was not a punishment detail, but something far more disorienting. Mrs. Washington pointed to aprons hanging on hooks, then to herself, then to the kitchen equipment around them. Her meaning became clear through gesture and tone rather than words. She was inviting them to work alongside her. Fumiko felt a strange lightness in her chest, something that might have been relief or might have been the beginning of hope. In Japanese military culture, useful work carried dignity. Being allowed to contribute meant being seen as something more than merely a burden or a threat. Mrs. Washington began by teaching them the fundamentals of kitchen work in her domain. She demonstrated how to wash vegetables in the large metal sinks, how to measure ingredients using the strange American cups and spoons that differed from Japanese measurements. But most importantly, she began teaching them about grits. She brought out a large container of dried corn kernels ground into a coarse meal that looked nothing like the smooth white substance they had been eating. Through pantomime and repetition, she showed them the transformation. Water and heat and time and care turned these rough grains into something soft and nourishing. Fumiko watched with fascination as Mrs. Washington added butter to the pot, the yellow fat melting into the white grits and creating swirls of gold. A pinch of salt from the large container, a handful of shredded cheese that melted into creamy richness. The older woman stirred with a practiced rhythm, her wooden spoon moving in steady circles. She handed the spoon to Fumiko, guiding her hand to maintain the same motion. "Keep it moving," she said in English, the words meaningless, but the intention clear. "Don't let it stick." 3 weeks into their stay at the Georgia facility, the rhythm of kitchen work had become familiar to Fumiko and the other women. They rose each morning, helped prepare breakfast, learned the strange alchemy of Southern cooking, and found in the repetitive tasks a kind of peace they had not expected to discover in captivity. Fumiko had become particularly skilled at making grits, understanding instinctively when the consistency was correct, when to add more liquid, when the cornmeal had absorbed enough butter to achieve the perfect, creamy texture that Mrs. Washington nodded approvingly at. But on September 12, 1945, that fragile peace shattered completely. Captain Ashford called a mandatory assembly in the main hall. His face carried an expression of grave concern as the 17 women filed in and took their seats on the wooden benches. Nurse Betsy Calloway stood beside him, her presence suggesting that medical or emotional support might be needed. Corporal Clemens positioned himself near the door, his usual easy manner replaced by uncomfortable tension. The captain held several folders containing official reports and communications from military intelligence channels. He had spent the previous evening deciding how to share information that he knew would devastate these women, information that had been filtering through military channels for weeks, but had only now been compiled into comprehensive reports about conditions in post-surrender Japan. He cleared his throat and began speaking slowly, pausing frequently to allow the one translator present, a Nisei soldier named Private Kenneth Yoshida, to render his words into Japanese. The reports painted a picture of devastation beyond anything the women had imagined. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had killed hundreds of thousands instantly, with thousands more dying daily from radiation sickness that doctors barely understood. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, and dozens of other cities had been reduced to ash and rubble by incendiary bombing campaigns. Millions of Japanese civilians were homeless, starving, living in makeshift shelters among ruins. The infrastructure that had sustained Japanese society had been obliterated. Food production had collapsed. Disease was spreading through overcrowded refugee centers. Fumiko listened to the translated words with growing horror, her mind trying to reconcile these descriptions with her memories of Yokohama's bustling streets and crowded neighborhoods. Her family lived in the Kanagawa ward, in a small wooden house near the harbor. Her father had been a clerk at a shipping company. Her mother had tended a small garden and taken in sewing to supplement the family income. Her younger brother had been drafted into military service in 1944, and she had not heard from him since. The report specified that Yokohama had been targeted by massive firebombing raids in May of 1945. Entire neighborhoods had burned. Casualty estimates ran into the tens of thousands. Hisako Yamamoto began weeping quietly when Private Yoshida translated information about Osaka. The industrial districts where her family had lived and worked had been primary targets for American bombers. The reports indicated that survival rates in those areas had been catastrophically low. Sachiko sat frozen, her face drained of color, as she learned that Kyoto, long spared from bombing due to its cultural significance, was now flooded with refugees from destroyed cities, overwhelming the ancient capital's ability to provide food and shelter. The days following the devastating news from Japan passed in a fog of grief and confusion. The women moved through their routines mechanically, their bodies performing tasks, while their minds struggled to process the magnitude of what they had learned. Fumiko found herself standing at the kitchen counter some mornings with no memory of how she had arrived there, her hands automatically measuring grits into boiling water, while her thoughts remained thousands of miles away in a Yokohama that might no longer exist. Mrs. Opal Washington watched the grief settle over her workers like a heavy blanket. She had seen this kind of sorrow before, the particular hollow-eyed devastation that came from not knowing whether loved ones were alive or dead. She did not speak Japanese, and the women's English remained limited, but she understood the universal language of loss. She began leaving small comforts where the women would find them: an extra pat of butter for their grits, a cup of hot tea appearing at their workstation, a hand on the shoulder that conveyed more than words could have managed. 2 weeks after the initial reports, Captain Ashford arranged for newsreel footage to be shown in the facility's small recreation room. The footage had been captured by American military photographers as occupation forces moved through Japan, and it showed scenes that would later become defining images of the war's aftermath. The women gathered in the darkened room, unsure what to expect, desperate for any visual confirmation of what had happened to their homeland. What they saw exceeded their worst imaginings. The screen showed aerial views of cities reduced to geometric patterns of ash and rubble, endless stretches of destruction where wooden buildings had once stood. Survivors picked through debris looking for anything salvageable. Children with hollow eyes and distended bellies stood in lines for food distribution. Medical facilities overflowing with burn victims and radiation patients whose suffering was beyond anything the women had been trained to treat. But then the footage shifted to something even more disturbing. The screen showed images that made several women gasp audibly, evidence of Japanese military atrocities, footage from prison camps in the Philippines and China, where Allied prisoners and local civilians had been subjected to systematic cruelty and starvation, documentation of medical experiments conducted on prisoners, mass graves, survivors with haunting testimonies about the brutality they had endured. Fumiko felt her stomach turn violently. She had served the imperial military with pride, believing the propaganda about liberating Asia from Western colonialism, about creating a co-prosperity sphere that would benefit all Asian peoples. She had processed communications that referred to operational necessities and strategic requirements, never questioning what those sanitized terms might actually mean in practice. Now she was confronting the reality that her service, her pride, her sense of purpose had been built on lies and atrocities she had never imagined possible. Sachiko began sobbing openly, her medical training making the images of prisoner mistreatment even more viscerally horrifying. She had taken an oath to heal, to cause no harm, to serve suffering humanity regardless of nationality. Learning that Japanese medical personnel had participated in experiments on living human subjects violated everything she believed about her profession's sacred duty. October brought cooler weather to Georgia, and with it the first official communications about repatriation procedures. Captain Ashford received detailed instructions from the War Department outlining the process by which Japanese prisoners of war would be returned to their homeland. Transport ships were being organized, processing centers established in West Coast ports, schedules coordinated with occupation authorities in Japan. For most prisoners across America, these announcements brought relief and anticipation. But for the 17 women in Valdosta, the news triggered a crisis that had been building since they first learned the truth about their devastated homeland. Late one evening, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the day's work completed, Fumiko sat in the dormitory with Sachiko and Hisako. The three women had become informal leaders among their group, the ones others looked to for guidance and interpretation of their increasingly complicated situation. They spoke in hushed Japanese, aware that their conversation touched on thoughts that felt almost treasonous to articulate aloud. "What do we return to?" Sachiko asked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of weeks of anguish. "I have received no word from my family in Kyoto. The Red Cross lists show no record of them in the refugee registries. They may all be dead or scattered across Japan with no way to find each other. Even if I could locate them, what could I offer them, except another mouth to feed when food is scarce?" Hisako nodded slowly, her practical mind wrestling with impossible calculations. "The reports say there is no work, no housing, no infrastructure remaining in Osaka. We would arrive as repatriated prisoners, marked as failures who allowed themselves to be captured rather than choosing death. We would be burdens to a country that can barely feed the citizens who never left." Fumiko stared at her hands, noting how they had changed during her months in captivity. Her fingers had grown stronger from kitchen work, her palms bearing small calluses from wooden spoons and hot pot handles. She thought about the morning's breakfast preparation, how Mrs. Washington had smiled with approval when Fumiko's grits achieved the perfect consistency. She thought about Corporal Clemens teaching her English words for kitchen equipment, his patient repetition never tinged with contempt. She thought about the abundance of food, the clean water, the way American staff treated them not as dangerous enemies, but as human beings deserving of basic dignity. "Here," Fumiko said slowly, testing words that felt dangerous even to speak, "here we have discovered something we never expected. The Americans we were taught to hate have shown us more kindness than we knew was possible. They feed us 3 meals every day when our own people are starving. They teach us their language without mockery. They allowed us to work with dignity rather than keeping us locked in cells." The other women in nearby beds had grown quiet, listening to this conversation that articulated thoughts many of them had been afraid to acknowledge. A young woman named Reiko, barely 20 years old, spoke up from across the room. "I cannot stop thinking about the grits," she said, her voice trembling. "Such a simple food, but Mrs. Washington taught us to make it as if teaching us something precious. She showed us care and patience. When I think about returning to Japan, I do not think about honor or duty anymore." The decision crystallized over the following weeks through countless whispered conversations and sleepless nights. 7 of the 17 women reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable when they first arrived at the Georgia facility. Led by Fumiko, they decided to make a request so unprecedented that none of them could find examples of it in any military history they knew. They would ask to remain in America rather than accept repatriation to Japan. The decision was not made lightly, nor was it unanimous. 10 of the women chose repatriation despite the uncertainty, driven by loyalty to families they hoped were still alive, by a sense of duty to help rebuild their shattered homeland, or simply by the deep human need to return to familiar ground even when that ground had been devastated. The division created no animosity among the women. They understood that each person faced impossible calculations with no clearly right answer. Fumiko spent 3 evenings crafting a letter in her careful English, checking each word with Private Yoshida to ensure her meaning was clear. She rewrote it 5 times, trying to strike the correct balance between humility and honest explanation. The final version was both a formal request and an emotional appeal that laid bare the transformation she and the others had undergone. On November 3, 1945, she requested a meeting with Captain Ashford. The captain received her in his office, a simple room with a desk, filing cabinets, and a window overlooking the compound. Nurse Betsy Calloway attended as protocol required when meeting with female prisoners. Corporal Clemens stood near the door, his presence both formal requirement and silent support. Fumiko entered with Sachiko and Hisako flanking her, the 3 women representing the 7 who had made this difficult choice. Fumiko held the letter with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts at composure. She had rehearsed her words repeatedly, but now facing the moment of actual request, she felt the weight of what she was asking. "Captain Ashford," she began in English that had improved dramatically over the past months. "I speak for 7 of us. We have written this letter to request something unusual." Her voice wavered, but held steady. She handed him the letter and waited while he read. The document explained their situation with painful honesty. It detailed the loss of contact with families, the reports of devastation in their home cities, the knowledge that they would return as marked women to a country where survival itself was uncertain. But more importantly, it described what they had found in American captivity: the unexpected kindness, the dignity of useful work, the discovery that enemies could become something approaching friends. "We do not ask this because we are cowards who fear hardship," the letter stated. "We ask because we have discovered in this place that the Japan we served was built on lies we never questioned. We have learned that the Americans we were taught to hate possess a capacity for mercy and fairness that challenges everything we believed. We wish to remain not to escape our past, but to build a future that honors the truth we have learned. Captain Ashford read the letter twice, his weathered face revealing little of his thoughts. When he finally looked up, he saw 7 young women standing before him with a mixture of hope and terror in their eyes. Captain Ashford's initial response to the unprecedented request was bureaucratic necessity. "I cannot make this decision alone," he told the women honestly. "This matter requires approval from the War Department, consultation with immigration authorities, and likely involvement of the State Department. What you're asking has no precedent in American military history that I am aware of. But," he added, seeing the fear that flashed across their faces, "I will forward your request with my recommendation that it receive serious consideration." The waiting period stretched across 3 weeks of agonizing uncertainty. During this time, word of the Japanese women's request leaked beyond the facility's boundaries and spread through Valdosta and surrounding communities. The local newspaper, the Valdosta Daily Times, ran a front-page story under the headline, "Japanese Prisoners Asked to Remain in Georgia." The article presented the basic facts, but also included interviews with townspeople whose reactions varied dramatically. Some residents expressed outrage at the very idea. Letters to the editor reminded readers of Pearl Harbor, of American boys who had died fighting Japan, of the audacity of enemy prisoners requesting special treatment. One writer demanded to know why these women should be allowed to stay when thousands of loyal Americans struggled to find work and housing after the war. The anger was real and rooted in genuine grief and sacrifice that deserved acknowledgement. But other voices began emerging with unexpected force. Reverend Thomas Mitchell of First Baptist Church wrote a thoughtful editorial about Christian principles of forgiveness and redemption. He noted that these were young women who had served in auxiliary roles, not combat soldiers, and that punishing them for their country's crimes seemed contrary to American values of individual responsibility and second chances. Several local business owners who had met the women during supervised visits to the facility wrote letters describing their evident sincerity and work ethic. Mrs. Opal Washington became an unlikely but powerful advocate. She spoke at a town council meeting, her testimony carrying weight because of her respected position in the community and her status as a mother of servicemen. "I've worked alongside these girls for months," she told the assembled council members and citizens. "I've watched them learn our ways, seen them cry over what their country did, heard them talk about wanting to do better. My boys fought against Japan, and I lost a nephew at Guadalcanal. I haven't forgotten, and I won't forget. But these particular girls aren't my enemies anymore. They're young women who got caught up in evil they didn't understand, and now they're trying to make different choices." Her words carried particular resonance because she spoke not from naive idealism, but from the authority of someone who had paid the war's price through her family's service and sacrifice. Other African American community members added their voices, noting the bitter irony that Japanese women were being debated while black servicemen returned home to continued discrimination and segregation. The debate reached the state capitol in Atlanta, where Governor Ellis Arnall, known for progressive racial policies by Southern standards of the time, expressed cautious support for allowing the women to remain if proper legal procedures could be established. His endorsement provided political cover for local officials who might have been sympathetic but feared constituent backlash. December 15, 1945, brought the final decision from Washington. Captain Ashford gathered all 17 women in the main hall, the same room where months earlier he had delivered devastating news about their homeland. This time, his expression carried something different, a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. The War Department had approved the unprecedented request with specific conditions. The 7 women who wished to remain would be reclassified as displaced persons eligible for supervised immigration status. They would require American sponsors willing to provide housing and assist with employment. They would undergo additional screening and would remain under periodic observation during their transition to civilian life. The relief that flooded through Fumiko was so powerful it made her knees weak. Beside her, Sachiko began crying quietly while Hisako maintained her characteristic stoicism, though her eyes glistened with suppressed emotion. The 10 women who had chosen repatriation embraced their friends with genuine happiness, their decision to return to Japan no less courageous than the decision to stay. Both groups were choosing difficult paths that required faith in uncertain futures. The sponsorship process moved faster than anyone expected, driven largely by Mrs. Opal Washington's determination and community connections. She personally offered to sponsor Fumiko, providing a room in her home and helping her find work as a translator for the military administration offices that were processing repatriation logistics. The Henderson family, owners of a local textile mill, sponsored Sachiko and arranged for her to continue nursing training at the county hospital. Hisako found sponsorship through a Methodist church whose congregation included several business owners impressed by her administrative skills. The farewell ceremony for the departing women took place on a cold January morning in 1946. The 10 who were returning to Japan stood in formation one final time, but the scene bore little resemblance to military protocol. American soldiers shook hands with Japanese women, exchanged addresses, promised to write. Mrs. Washington distributed carefully wrapped packages of food for the journey and small recipe cards she had written out in English, hoping the women might find ingredients in Japan eventually. Fumiko presented each departing friend with a handwritten letter to carry home, messages addressed to any surviving family members explaining what had happened to their daughters and sisters during captivity. Corporal Wyatt Clemens approached Sachiko before she left, carrying a small box tied with string. Inside was a carefully packed bag of grits and a handwritten note explaining how to prepare them. His face flushed as he handed it to her. "For when things get better over there," he said quietly, "so you can remember that even enemies can share a meal." Sachiko accepted the gift with a deep bow, her English finally confident enough to express her gratitude properly. "You showed me that Americans have kind hearts," she told him. "I will tell everyone in Japan what I learned here." The years that followed brought transformation beyond what anyone could have predicted. Fumiko worked as a translator throughout the occupation period, eventually establishing her own translation service that helped facilitate Japanese-American business relationships during the post-war reconstruction. In 1953, she married a Nisei veteran named Thomas Nakamura, who had served as a translator with occupation forces.